This is topic 3, part 1. We're going to look at aorist passive indicative verbs and future passive indicative verbs. And so we will review the rules for forming aorist passive verbs. We'll actually very briefly look at aorist middle and active verbs. Then we'll review the rules for forming future passive verbs and also look at future active and future middle very briefly. And then we'll go through examples of future and aorist passive verbs. So the aorist active and middle, we saw those recently, and we noted that for both imperfects and aorists, we have an augment, typically this epsilon augment that comes before the rest of the verb. And for first aorist, we have a stem that's the same as the present or imperfect, usually. For the first aorist, we have a tensed formative of sa, sigma alpha. There's no connecting vowel. For second aorist, the stem will be different from the present and imperfect stem. There is no tense formative, and the connecting vowels are equal to the imperfect, so they're the same. In addition, aorist active and middle verbs use secondary endings. Now let's move on to the aorist passive. So there's a first and a second aorist passive. The first aorist passive has several characteristics, and actually all of the aorist passives are similar in some ways to the aorist active and aorist middle. For the aorist passive stem, there is the same augment as we see for the aorist active and aorist middle. The epsilon, when there's a consonant, or if there's a vowel, then that vowel gets lengthened. There's a tense formative. It's the, theta, eta. There are no connecting vowels. Typically, if you've got a tense formative, you don't need connecting vowels. And then we have secondary active endings for the first aorist passive. And there's one exception. We'll see that in a second. So here are the secondary active endings. So we have nu, sigma, a null, and then men, te. And the normal secondary active endings have a noon here. This is replaced by a san, sigma alpha nu. It's like the sigma alpha from the regular active and middle aorists has been imported over here so that we can detect the third person plural more easily. Let's look briefly at the paradigm with all of them laid out here. So we have eluthane. So here's the tense formative the bumping up against the active ending. And there's really no surprises here. We got the plus n giving us thane, face, the, which is what you'd expect with a null ending, thamen, theta, and thesan. So all of this is very straightforward. Let's look at some possible stem changes that can occur between the aorist passive as compared with the active or the middle. So in some cases, the stem is the same. So we have agapesa. So the stem here is agapa, or agape. The alpha in agapao lengthens before the ending. The passive is agapethane. So the stem is the same for agapao. This would be I loved, and this would be I was loved, passive sense of the aorist. And just like the active aorist, the view is looking at the action from outside. Again, context always fills that in for you. We can't make absolute statements about what any tense means in any context, but it tends to be looking at the action from outside. Now we may have a different stem for the aorist passive compared to the active or middle. For instance, the verb harao, I see, the active of the aorist is adon, I saw, but the passive is ophthane, so it's quite different. Actually, these are all very different. We have harao. Adon is somewhat related to the word that we have for video. Video would be where we get video. Further considerations about stem change. Sometimes we can have a second aorist in the aorist active, but it ends up having a first aorist ending in the passive. So here we have the verb lambano, and the second aorist for the active is elaben. So the lambda alpha beta stem here is different than the lambda alpha mu beta stem. And the second aorist has a different stem. Note for the passive, not only is the stem different, we have length, this phi jumping in there, and the alpha lengthening to an eta, but we also have the first aorist passive ending, the they. So there's sometimes not rhyme or reason to exactly how these things are formed, and we have to look at our principal parts in the lexicon to figure out the aorist passive. There's also some irregular stems for the aorist passive. So for example, we have akuo, I hear. Akusa would be I heard. For the passive, we have akusthane. So interestingly, this sigma hangs around, and then we have the normal first aorist passive ending, the they plus the secondary active ending. So we can tell this is akuo, but that sigma just jumps in there, and we just have to deal with it. Let's take a look at the second aorist passive. So it has the same augment, the epsilon or the lengthened vowel for a verb that begins with a vowel. The tense formative is different. Rather than being they, it's just an eta by itself. There are no connecting vowels. And again, we use secondary active endings as we do for the first aorist passive. And again, there's one exception, which is the third plural, which has that san ending. All the rest of the endings are the same. They're the secondary active endings. But instead of a noon, we have a san. Very quickly, here is our table of second aorist passive. We're using grapho. It is formed with second aorist passives, and we have agraphane. So we have the tense formative is eta, the ending is nu, and these are all fairly straightforward. We have ain, ace, a, amen, eta, asan, and that just corresponds down the table. So no surprises here. Here's some examples of aorist passive. The first one is ephabethesan. And this comes from the verb phabeamai. Some lexicons you'll see that as phabeo, but it appears in the New Testament only as a middle or passive. It's listed in some lexicons as phabeomai. In any case, here we have the aorist passive tense formative, they, and then the third plural ending, san. So it's aorist passive indicative third person plural. It means they were feared. Here we have ephanesan, ephanesan, another third plural. We can see the san right away. This is a case, though, where we have a second aorist. The tense formative is just an eta here. So we have phan, that is our aorist stem for the verb phino, second aorist, and then we have just the single tense formative and then san. So ephanesan. This would be third plural, so phino typically means to shine, but it can mean to appear or become visible. And so in the passive, this would be they were made visible. All right, another example here. Agraphe. Here's an example where we just have the second aorist passive tense formative, and then we have grapho, to write. And so this would be third singular. There's no ending, and so it was written. Finally, we have ophthe. This goes back to the form of harao we saw. And so it is a they, tells us it's an aorist passive. And we've got the third singular ending because there's no final ending here, making it null. So third singular. And basically, it was seen would be the translation of that. So some examples of first aorist and second aorist passives. Let's go on and look at the future passive, but we'll begin by looking at future active and middle. We saw that a while ago. So with future, there's no augment. The future stem may be different from the present stem. There is a tense formative, which is sigma. The contract vowels, alpha, epsilon, and omicron, lengthen before the sigma, usually. And then we have primary endings, primary active and middle endings. Now let's go on and look at the first future passive. The reason that we look at future passive together with aorist passive is because they share some things in common. In particular, they share a stem. So for the future passive, the aorist passive stem is used. Now, unlike the aorist, this is a future, so there's no augment. The tense formative for the first future passive is thais. There are some connecting vowels. So the future is one of the rare cases where we have a tense formative and connecting vowels. And then we use primary middle passive endings. Let's look at our table of first future passives. We have the tense formative thais. Connecting vowel are normal ones for the primary tenses. So we have a, e, a. And then these go together fairly straightforwardly. Lu, the, sa, mai. Just as happens for the middle passives in the present tense, the ending for the second singular is an eta with an iota subscript due to the sigma dropping out and contraction. The rest of them are straightforward. We have luthesatai, luthesamatha, luthesastha, and luthesantai. So mostly pretty straightforward. Here are some examples of first future passive. So we have akusthesatai, akusthesatai. And just as with the aorist that we saw a little while ago, notice that sigma hangs around even though we'd expect it to drop out. It's akusthes. So we'd expect it to be akuthes, but we can still tell what the verb is. And mainly we're looking at the tense formative, the thes, and then the connecting vowel, epsilon, and then the ending tai. So this is a third singular. We have the mai, sai, tai, and the singulars of the primary middle passives. And it is from akuo, so this would be it will be heard. It will be heard. So it has future aspect, which typically is looking at the action as a whole, but it's the passive voice. Here we have sothese, sothese. This comes from sodzo. We noted a while back that sodzo, the stem is sod with a delta, and so that delta bumps up against the theta ending, and it, based on the rules of square of stops, the delta drops out. So we just have sothese. Here is our nice thais tense formative, and then the second singular ending. So it's a future passive indicative, second person singular of sozo, you will be saved, you will be delivered. In some contexts, it's referring to somebody being healed, you will be healed. Here is kleithesestha, kleithesestha. So this comes from kaleo. The aorist passive stem is clay. Remember we talked about using the aorist passive stem for the future passives. So we have clay, and then the tense formative, thais, and then the connecting vowel epsilon, and then stha, the ending. So kleisesthestha. So this is a second plural, and it would be you all will be called from kaleo. And finally, we have poiethesamai, poiethesamai. And so we have poieo, which has an epsilon contract vowel, and that's going to lengthen to an eta. So poie. Then we have thais, and then we have amai being our ending. So that's first singular, first passive indicative. I will be made. I'm not quite sure how we'd translate that. I will be made a robot. That is the parsing for that verb. Probably we would see this more commonly as third singular as it will be made or it will be done. Second future passive is similar. It uses the aorist passive stem and there's no augment, just like for first future. In this case, the tense formative, rather than being thais, is just ace. So just eta sigma. We're still using the primary connecting vowels, and we're still using middle passive endings. So really there's not a lot of difference except for this tense formative is different. And there's no easy way to predict as to which verbs are going to be first versus second future passive. We look briefly at the full table for the second future passive. We're using the example here of apostello, and so we have apostal asamai, apostal asamai. So notice that there is the ace that comes there. The apostello has a double L. This drops the L, which helps us to tell that it's not present tense. But we also have the ace. There's no augment, so it's still the alpha at the beginning. And then we have the a my, the a connecting vowel, my ending. So this is apostalesamai, first singular, apostalace, apostalacetai, apostalasamen, apostalaesestha, and finally apostalasantai. The tense formative is different, but it's similar enough to the first future that we can usually tell what's going on. Let's look at some examples of second future passive. So we have one that we just saw, apostalasantai, a third plural passive. So it's a future passive indicative, third plural of apostello, and the meaning would then be they will be sent. So this passive voice and third plural. Next example is karesamai, and the ace tells us that we're looking at a future passive. It's kairo, so the stem changes, it drops the iota, kar ace amai, which is our nice first singular ending. And this is a case where even though it's future passive, it has an active meaning. And so Paul uses this in Philippians 1:18, I will rejoice. So it's just a characteristic of this verb that it can be used in the passive and yet still have an active meaning. Another example, phanesatai. So this is another example from phino. So we have iota in the present tense, and then the iota drops out in the future and aorist, and we have phan, and then ace is our tense formative, and then etai, our third singular connecting vowel and ending. So it's third singular, and this would be something like he, she, it will appear. Finally, we have anoigesetai. Anoigo is to open. The ace is our future passive, and notice there's no augment. There was no augment up here at the top either in the first one. No augment means we're not looking at past tense, so we're not looking at an aorist or an imperfect. And ace is telling us it's future passive, and then the etai verifies that we have a middle passive ending. And so this is third singular, it will be opened. This is in Matthew 7:7. Knock and it will be opened to you. Let's look at some examples from the Bible, really. They show up in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Hebrew workbook, the 4th edition. I'm including the bibliographical information here so you can go check it out if you want to. But these are really Bible verses, so and in some cases I've added some extra from what is in the workbook. So John 14:21b. Let me read that. Ha de agapon me agapethesetai, nice future passive, hupa tu patras mu, kago agapeso autan, kai emphaniso auto emautan. Okay, so we have this postpositive de, that's going to come at the beginning, and then ha agapon, we haven't quite gotten to participles yet. This is just the one who loves, comes from agape, the one who loves. The participle ha agapon is nominative masculine singular. We learn this from the definite article ha, and this tells us that we could be looking at the subject of the sentence. In addition, the verbal idea embedded in the participle, one who loves, could have an object, and we see the accusative object me. So we have the one who loves me. Now we're looking for the main verb of the sentence that will tell us something about the one who loves me. Agapathesetai. So here we have a tense formative, thais, and agape, agapao, the alpha lengthens to an eta, and then etai, which is a third singular ending. And so the one who loves me, and it looks like this is the subject then, agapon, the one who loves, will be loved, agapathesetai, hupa tu patras, by the father mu, of me, so by my father. Kago, which is just a smushing together of kai plus ego, so and I. Kago, agapeso, this is a future active indicative of agapao. So we have the tense formative there, and then we have the typical active ending. So agapeso, autan. So I will love him, autan. Kai emphaniso is another future tense verb. So again, we have a sigma tense formative, just like we had back over here on agapeso. And the verb is emphino, which is like phino. It's derived from phino, emphino, and it means to manifest. Emphaniso is I will manifest, and then at the end we have emautan, which is myself. I'm not sure if we've had that yet in vocabulary, but emautan, and I will manifest myself to him. So, and the one who loves me will be loved by the Father of me, by my Father, and I will love him, and I will manifest myself to him. Oh, and I had this spelled wrong. This is MO2 with an omicron. So MO2 is myself, and there comes in a couple of different forms. It doesn't show up in the nominative, interestingly, but in the genitive, dative, and accusative. All right, let's look at John 1:42. All right, let's read this now. egagen auton pros ton Iesun. Emblepsas auto ha Jesus epen su e Simon ha huias Ioannou su klethese Kephas ha hermeneutai Petros. Well, so we see Simon and Petros, Simon and Peter. So we might figure out that it has something to do with the Apostle Peter. This was actually before he was an apostle. So let's take a look at what's going on here. We have egagen. This comes from the verb ago. The stem looks like it changes here. So it goes from the gamma to a gamma alpha gamma. So I suspect we're looking at second aorist. If you check it out, the imperfect for this would be again. So the imperfect follows the stem of the present tense. Since we have egagen, we're looking at an aorist. So this is an aorist from ago. We don't have an explicit subject. We have he brought him pros ton Iesun, to the Jesus or to Jesus. So he in this case, I believe, is probably Andrew, and him would be Peter. So Andrew brought Peter to Jesus. Emblepsas, this is a participle, and here it just means looking at. And so looking at him, auto, looking at him or looking to him, ha Jesus apen, Jesus apen, said. This is a nice aorist of lego, apen, third singular. So Jesus said, and here's the quote, Su e Simon, you are Simon. So this is just a nice present active indicative of a me. You are Simon, Chahuios Ioannou, the son of John. Su klethese, and here is our future tense verb, passive, of kaleo. You will be called kephas, a rock. Ha is a relative pronoun. Hermeneutai, and this is comes from the verb hermeneuo, which is where we get the word hermeneutics, and it is a middle passive of that verb, which is translated, which is interpreted, present middle passive indicative, and it's third singular, so which is translated Petros, Peter. So let's go back to the beginning. He led him to Jesus. Looking up or looking at him, Jesus said, you are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas, which is interpreted Petros. We got one example of a future passive. And then finally, let's look at John 7:53 into John 8:1. Kai eparuthesan, hekastas eis ton oikon autou. Jesus de eparuthe eis ta aras ton eleon. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got kai and then we have eparuthesan. So here we have a verb paruamai, and that is to go, to come. And so we have an augment here, and we have the face tense formative. So we're looking at an aorist passive. Now paruamai, with that amai ending, typically has an active meaning in the middle or the passive, and in this case it's in the passive. It is a third plural with a san ending, so we have they went, and they went hekastas, each, eis ton oikon autou, to the house of him, or to his house. So the first part is, and they went each to his house. Jesus de, so we have the postpositive de, probably but here, maybe and Jesus, or but Jesus, eperuthe. And here we have another aorist passive from the same verb, from paruamai. And this is a third singular, and it's also aorist passive. For paruamai, it's got an active meaning. So we have, and Jesus went esta aras ton eleon, to the Mount of Olives. So, and they went each to his house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Some examples of aorist passive and future passive verbs.